The Boy Scouts motto, "Be prepared," emphasized traits like trustworthiness, loyalty, helpfulness, friendliness, courtesy, kindness, and reverence. Oddly enough, it seemed to include naivety, foolishness, and blind trust as well. Greg rarely checked his wife's iPhone, something she was well aware of, so she made sure to lock it tight. As a former Boy Scout, he held honesty and privacy in high regard, but with his wife's upcoming trip, Greg found himself at a loss, unable to remember the name of her hotel. He wanted to avoid another argument over his forgetfulness, which had become all too common. This trip, their longest separation since marrying 5 years ago, had Greg contemplating romantic gestures like sending flowers. Yet the irony of Paris, the city of love, stung him deeply. She wouldn't be there to love him. Her interest lay with Chris, her travel companion. Desperate, Greg used their wedding date to unlock her phone and stumbled upon work emails between his wife and Chris. They laid out romantic plans for Paris. What shocked him, almost as much as the affair, was their use of work emails to communicate. Both Susan and Chris were legal professionals and should have known better. Susan was a lawyer, and Chris worked as a paralegal at her firm. They were familiar with document handling and litigation, having sifted through countless emails that often revealed affairs, only to determine their relevance and how to minimize fallout. Greg had initially paid little attention to the specifics of Susan's trip or the hotel's name, driven by an uneasy feeling. His legal background had honed his intuition and listening skills, and something felt off when Susan described the trip as a routine arbitration with no time for sightseeing. She avoided his eyes, her nonchalant attitude clashing with their dream of visiting Paris together. Her response had struck him as strange, leaving him blindsided by the worst-case scenario he hadn't anticipated. An email subject line hit him hard. "Why don't you just ditch the Boy Scouts so we can enjoy more time together without worry?" This was Chris' latest message, and Susan's reply was just as unsettling. "I feel safe with him." Overwhelmed by a mix of betrayal and perverse intrigue, Greg typed out his response, adding a smiley face emoji at the end. Unsure of his next move, Greg decided to print the incriminating email using the Wi-Fi printer in the basement, viewing it as a precautionary measure. His experience as a seasoned lawyer taught him the importance of preserving evidence, so he printed the email and stashed it in his computer bag. Taking a moment to gather his thoughts, Greg devised a plan. He saw it as a win-win situation. He considered pretending to make a romantic gesture towards Susan, only to abruptly, accidentally collide with a tree in the woods behind their house. On the other hand, he figured Chris would show less mercy if the roles were reversed. Greg knew he had to strategize carefully. His talent for strategic thinking defined him as a lawyer. He was paid for his intellect, not his physical strength. Greg had to act swiftly, knowing Susan would soon return from her run. But before diving into his plan, he had some immediate tasks to complete, finishing an assignment and securing a hotel booking, though not for sending flowers. He wasn't sure why he needed the hotel information, but he felt compelled to obtain it. He found La Tour Eiffel Hotel near the Trocadero, a short walk from the International Chamber of Commerce, where Susan and Chris would be handling their arbitration case. Greg quickly researched Virginia's divorce laws, recalling details from his bar exam 5 years ago. He remembered that infidelity was grounds for divorce and could influence alimony and property division. However, there were defenses against infidelity charges, such as reconciliation. He knew he had to leave the house quickly, avoiding confrontation for now. His goal was to shock Susan into disbelief, using a strategic approach akin to shock and awe to end the marriage. Lies would be necessary, even if they contradicted Scout law. This was war. Winston Churchill once said, "In war, truth is so precious that it must be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Greg now viewed his deceit as necessary, no longer bound by any vows of honesty. In the bedroom, Greg hurriedly packed his essentials, placing the suitcases by the front door. He collected crucial documents: bank statements, credit card records, retirement accounts, car titles, pay stubs, mortgage papers, and Susan's latest student loan balance. Hearing Susan return from her run and move around in the kitchen, Greg composed a worried expression as he came up from his basement office. Seeing her sipping Gatorade, her brown hair tied back, he couldn't deny her beauty, but her betrayal turned his stomach. He accepted that their love was over. He approached her with a somber smile, announcing his sudden plans to travel to Paris. Her face went pale and the light faded from her blue eyes. She demanded an explanation, her shock quickly giving way to suspicion. Greg concocted a story about Nico calling him to prepare a crucial witness for an insurance case, explaining the judge's irritation over a disrupted court schedule. He hinted that he might return occasionally for laundry, planning to be away for several weeks. Susan, masking her concern, suggested maybe Greg's firm was hiring. Feigning enthusiasm, Greg expressed a wish to join her in Paris, noticing a flicker of worry in her eyes before she joked about him sending his resume, even though her law school was ranked higher than his. She moved as if to hug him, but he stepped away, heading back to his office, struggling to suppress the urge to lash out. Susan asked about dinner plans, and Greg told her he couldn't stay and would grab something on the road, explaining that Nico was pressing him to leave immediately. She followed him to the door, her concern slightly visible as he picked up his suitcases and left. Declining a goodbye kiss, she claimed a sore throat and potential cold, voicing worry about passing anything to him. Greg told Susan he wouldn't return until Friday at the earliest, mentioning stops in Roanoke and Baltimore. He sensed she was already calculating the newfound freedom his absence might offer. With a wave, he drove off, hoping she'd believe he was swamped with work and irritated about being called in on a Saturday. His acting wasn't Oscar-worthy, but he was sure she was planning to contact Chris the moment he left. He drove to the nearest shopping center and found a coffee shop. Like many lawyers, Greg found clarity through pen and paper. As he nursed his coffee, he started listing cases and strategies. It dawned on him that reconciliation had never crossed his mind. Revenge was his sole focus, but to what degree remained uncertain. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a phone ringing from an unfamiliar number. Frustrated, he answered, only to hear Mark Taylor on the line. Taylor quickly introduced himself as a developer who bought old houses to replace them with McMansions. He acknowledged the disdain for his work but highlighted the temptation of a hefty check. The idea of demolishing their cozy home shocked Greg, but he quickly recovered as Taylor made his pitch. He offered a lucrative deal to buy their house for demolition, despite the uncertain timelines of new construction. Greg couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. Susan had chosen the house just before their wedding, a quaint ranch in a peaceful setting with a charming yard, woods, and a creek. The treehouse visible from the bedroom window symbolized their dream of a family. Greg appreciated the location's convenience, with easy access to major highways and a reasonable commute to work. The idea of selling it all and disrupting Susan's plans was tantalizing. Greg informed Taylor about his packed schedule over the next few days and arranged a meeting for Sunday morning. Taylor assured him he had already evaluated the property from the outside and didn't need to see the interior. He also mentioned he would likely handle the closing himself using a power of attorney for his wife, who was tied up with work. As they finalized the details, Greg couldn't help but think about Susan's misguided sense of security with her Boy Scout. What she didn't realize was that the Boy Scouts' ideals were rooted in military scouting, emphasizing skills like stealth and self-reliance. She had unknowingly walked into a trap, reminiscent of a military ambush. Before moving forward, Greg decided to conduct some reconnaissance. He deliberately knocked over his empty coffee cup, stepped out to his car for privacy, and dialed a number on his cell phone. After a few rings, he connected with Evan Scott, a former private investigator Greg had worked with during his time as a corporate lawyer. Evan had often assisted with pro bono legal cases, reflecting Greg's commitment to public service. Greg explained the urgent favor he needed, detailing the situation with his wife and her affair. Evan was astonished by Susan's audacity and offered to handle the matter himself, grateful for Greg's past help in the Rivera divorce case, which had garnered significant publicity. Greg thanked Evan and provided details about their house and the backyard, mentioning its direct access to the bedroom where Susan practiced martial arts with the curtains open. He suggested Evan could use this for surveillance, accessible by traversing the woods and leaping over the creek after dark. Greg also mentioned his plan to set up a camera outside, aimed at the front of the house to monitor activities. After finalizing arrangements with Evan, Greg reached out to Tom, a lawyer he intended to hire for his divorce proceedings. Despite Tom's initial confusion about the call, Greg clarified that he needed legal representation due to his wife's infidelity. Tom suggested meeting the following day to start working on the case, acknowledging the importance of gathering clear evidence of infidelity and navigating the financial complexities. given Susan's resources and support from her colleagues. Greg assured Tom that he would handle the situation and expressed confidence in resolving it amicably. Next, Greg considered potential retaliation. When asked about it, he made it clear he wasn't planning to retaliate, but preferred to adopt a wait-and-see approach. For his final call, Greg reached out to Ella, approaching her with tact. After a brief silence, Ella was pleased to hear from him after so long. Greg asked for her assistance, mentioning Susan's recent behavior. Ella admitted that Susan's actions had created a rift between them, but expressed willingness to help Greg as a friend. After briefly outlining his plan, Greg was met with Ella's laughter, indicating her amusement at the situation. She agreed to assist him, noting that he had a knack for making her laugh. Greg expressed his gratitude and promised to take Ella and her partner out for dinner once things settled. Ella accepted the invitation, confirming it as a date. Needing some privacy to strategize, Greg found lodging at an extended-stay hotel outside the Fairfax Beltway, far from their usual spots. After settling in, he ventured out to find something to eat. Even though he wasn't hungry, Greg knew he needed to eat to balance out the drinks he planned to consume. The nearby restaurant, El Mariachi, seemed like a good choice. Despite the complimentary chips and cheese likely causing him discomfort, he took a seat in a booth. As he settled in, he noticed the bartender watching him but brushed off the thought, too preoccupied with his own concerns. The menu's offerings, with their hints of Central American influence masquerading as Mexican, didn't faze him. He ordered tequila, bracing himself for a rough hangover the next day. The waitress soon returned with top-shelf tequila and a glass, gesturing towards the bartender who poured himself a generous serving. Greg recognized the bartender from Rivera's legal proceedings, where he had always been seated alone in the last row, dining in silence. Greg made mental notes and drank his tequila. After finishing his meal, he headed to the break room, feeling as though the surroundings were swaying like a ship. When he returned to his booth, he found the bartender now seated across from him. The bartender greeted Greg warmly, thanking him for his role in helping his cousin escape an abusive marriage. Despite Greg's attempts to downplay his involvement, the bartender continued, revealing that the abusive husband had been severely injured in jail and might suffer permanent damage. Greg was taken aback, feeling a chill as the bartender relayed this news with a hint of a smile. He responded that he hadn't known the extent of the injuries, to which the bartender casually remarked that it was old news. Curious about why Greg was alone on a Saturday night, the bartender asked about his wife's whereabouts, noting Greg's marital status with a knowing smile. Greg realized the bartender must have witnessed an unexpected encounter between him and Susan at a hearing, followed by a kiss. Admitting to some marital problems, including Susan's potential infidelity, Greg saw no reason to hide the truth. The bartender responded with a familiar smile, suggesting that while he might not be a lawyer, he understood the importance of keeping secrets. He hinted at Greg's exposed notebook, which contained incriminating details and a to-do list. Greg shrugged off the security lapse, noting that at least no client secrets had been compromised. The bartender then probed Greg about his deeper desires beyond money, suggesting revenge might be an option. Greg confessed his urge to inflict physical harm on Susan, specifically mentioning breaking her nose and blackening her eyes. The bartender warned against such violent retaliation, reminding Greg of the possible legal consequences that could land him in jail. Greg nodded in agreement, acknowledging the caution. Despite the bartender's insistence on repaying Greg for past assistance, Greg tried to redirect the conversation, mentioning Evan's role in gathering evidence and the involvement of the police. He also had enlisted a partner from his firm to ensure the criminal proceedings were handled correctly and that his client was treated respectfully by prosecutors. The bartender, undeterred, commended Greg for his dedication to helping others and offered his own assistance. When Greg expressed uncertainty about the bartender's true identity, the bartender introduced himself as Luis Hernandez, also known as Shadow to some. Greg joked about having to sell his soul for a favor, to which Shadow responded with a chuckle, saying it was merely a professional courtesy. Shadow instructed Greg to provide his address, Susan's name, and her daily routine. He suggested Greg get a cell phone for easier communication and to leave a contact number at the bar. He advised Greg not to return to the bar, claiming it was for the best. Greg updated Shadow about hiring a private investigator, his plan to stay home until Susan's departure for France, and her travel plans. Shadow claimed to know the location of Susan's Paris hotel, but kept the method of obtaining this information vague. "Just one question, Senor Greg," Shadow asked, his smile replaced by a serious expression. "Is there any chance for reconciliation, forgiveness, or mercy? I don't want any doubts later." Greg met his gaze, took a deep breath, and reflected on his emotions. The path ahead was clear. Trust and loyalty were crucial to him, and those qualities were sorely lacking in his marriage. Susan's actions had transformed love into hate in his heart. While he might eventually become indifferent, that time had not yet come. "No," he affirmed. Shadow visibly relaxed, satisfied with the answer. When the waitress brought the bill, Shadow dismissed her, but allowed Greg to leave a generous tip. He also permitted Greg to take a bottle of tequila, advising him to use it wisely. Greg woke up on Sunday morning with only a slight hangover and arrived at Tom's law office at 10 a.m., finding Evan already there. Evan handed Greg a DVD with evidence of Susan's infidelity and informed him that Susan was indeed with another man in their bed. He warned Greg against watching it immediately, but provided a summary of the evidence. Evan described how he had observed Susan and the man, identified as Chris Walker, engaged in sexual activity in the treehouse, just as Greg had suspected. They planned to draft a report and affidavit for Tom to file. Expressing regret about the situation, Greg decided to file for divorce on grounds of infidelity, but requested that Susan not be served immediately. He instructed Tom to file the paperwork on Monday afternoon, before the clerk's office closed. Tom reminded Greg of his limitations in criminal law and cautioned that he wouldn't be able to help if Greg encountered legal trouble. Greg left the office and headed to his next appointment with Mark Taylor. The meeting proved to be exceptionally productive. Greg discovered that they could sell the house for over $100,000 more than the mortgage, with no commission to a real estate agent. Susan would be ecstatic, Greg thought. He assured Mark that he'd have all the necessary paperwork ready to finalize the sale quickly. After leaving Mark's office, Greg checked his phone. No messages, no calls. Susan must still be occupied with Chris. Seizing the chance, Greg called his boss Nico, urgently requesting 2 weeks off or he'd resign. Recognizing Greg's crucial role in the ongoing case, Nico agreed hastily. Fortunately, Nico's workload had eased, giving Greg some flexibility. With the groundwork laid, Greg returned to the hotel to focus on the real work. By Monday evening, he was fully prepared. Throughout Sunday night and Monday, Susan left voice messages that he ignored, conserving his energy for Tuesday morning. Thanks to Evan's strategically placed camera outside the house, Greg knew that Chris had spent Monday night there. He estimated Chris would leave for work around 8 a.m. and Susan around 8:30 a.m. Greg planned his move for 7 a.m. Greg entered the house through the front door, cheerfully announcing, "Honey, I'm home." He heard hurried footsteps upstairs, followed by Susan coming down in her robe, looking disheveled and shocked. She greeted him with an attempt at cheerfulness, but her exhaustion and panic were evident. Greg apologized for his unexpected return, attributing it to the unpredictable nature of business trips. He ignored the wine glasses in the living room and headed straight to the dining room, where he began organizing papers on the table. Meanwhile, Susan, anxious about Greg discovering Chris upstairs, hesitated before answering a knock at the door. Greg asked her to handle it while he continued with his task. To Susan's surprise, Ella walked in and greeted them. Ella joined them at the dining table and started unpacking her briefcase. Greg explained that he had made financial and medical preparations for Susan's upcoming overseas trip due to his hectic schedule. He also mentioned securing a refinancing offer for their mortgage and apologized for the short notice. Susan appeared relieved upon realizing that Ella was a notary, and she even joked about Greg's preparedness, playfully referring to him as her Boy Scout. Despite the lighthearted comment, her cautious demeanor remained. Greg handed Susan a pen, guiding her to where she needed to sign on the documents, and encouraged her to read them thoroughly. She quickly signed everything, placing her trust in Greg as she did. He hoped that her trust was sincere. As he handed each document to Ella for notarization, Susan retrieved her driver's license. Ella photographed it and recorded the details in her notary journal, while Greg and Ella exchanged amused glances, struggling to suppress their smirks. Susan offered coffee, but both Greg and Ella declined. Ella continued documenting the notarized papers, while Greg sorted them into folders. Susan glanced up, anticipating Greg's next move and planning her own actions once Ella left. After Ella discreetly packed away her tools and smiled at Greg when Susan wasn't looking, Greg gave Susan a brief respite, citing a need for a teleconference. He retreated to his basement office, allowing Susan time to usher Chris out and erase any evidence of his presence. Once Greg felt that enough time had passed, he descended to keep up the pretense of ignorance. He feigned not noticing the sounds of Chris's departure or the garage door closing as Chris' car left. However, upon hearing the shower running in the master bath, Greg gathered his belongings, exited through the basement door, and drove away without a word to his unsuspecting wife. 2 hours later, after a hearty breakfast at a diner, Greg arrived at Tom's office. Tom looked shocked when Greg confirmed that Susan had signed the necessary forms for the divorce petition and had waived service of court notices. Greg confirmed that the forms were properly notarized and stated that his wife had agreed to a property division arrangement. This agreement granted him all proceeds from the house sale, her cars, and jewelry, leaving him full discretion over her belongings. Both parties would retain their respective retirement accounts, and he would not be required to pay alimony. When asked about Susan's financial situation, Greg explained that she earned more than he did anyway. Tom reviewed the documents, noting that Susan was exiting the marriage with minimal assets and significant debt. Greg confirmed this, attributing it to Susan's own decision. Tom scrutinized Greg briefly before refocusing on the paperwork. Greg further confirmed that Susan had signed an affidavit admitting to infidelity. This included acknowledging her lover's presence in the marital bedroom at the time of signing and affirming the authenticity of the email correspondences discussing their affair. He emphasized that the documents were clear and spoke for themselves. Initially surprised, Tom eventually smiled, recognizing Greg's respected reputation and their long-standing friendship from law school. He decided to proceed with filing the documents, though he expressed disbelief at the situation. Greg, feeling immense embarrassment, acknowledged that he had been consumed by his client's breach of trust, and remarked that if anyone deserved disbarment, it would be himself. The judge then inquired whether the notary could confirm Susan's signature on the documents and if Susan had thoroughly reviewed them. Greg assured Tom that Susan had meticulously reviewed the documents, given her extensive experience as a litigator. Tom confirmed he would file all necessary paperwork that day, including Evan's affidavit, along with the accompanying photos and DVD. He intended to keep the DVD out of the electronic file for the time being to avoid drawing undue attention. Greg agreed, stressing the importance of discretion, especially with Susan's imminent departure for Paris in a little over 2 weeks. Tom then inquired if Greg had any contacts at the county courthouse. He mentioned Jake, a classmate from the year below, who was now clerking there to enhance his resume. Tom suggested that Jake might help speed up the legal process, but cautioned that if the judge required live testimony, it could complicate matters. He pointed out that Susan would have the option to contest the allegations once she grasped the full picture. Tom also noted that if the situation soured, he might have to reconsider representing Greg. Greg acknowledged this and agreed to revisit the issue later, but not immediately. Evan wasn't sure if they would meet again during the week or at the office, but promised to keep Greg informed if anything changed. With Susan out of the house, Greg took the opportunity to gather important financial documents and finalize the sale of the house to Mark Taylor, with the transaction scheduled for Susan's first week in France. During this period, Greg concentrated on self-care, hitting the gym, enjoying leisurely reading, and reflecting on his life's direction. By the following Saturday, Evan reported that Susan had returned to the house with Chris. Greg thanked him for the update and showed his indifference. He mentioned that once the house was sold, he'd rather destroy the sheets than sell them. After viewing the video Evan had given him, Greg noted that Chris, a few years younger and obsessed with his physique, constantly admired himself in the mirror after workouts. Aside from that, Chris seemed quite ordinary. Greg, though fit, wasn't particularly chiseled, something Susan evidently desired. He had no time for such superficial concerns. Before he knew it, Susan was on her way to Paris. A private investigator shadowed Susan to the airport, confirming her departure for Europe. With Susan out of the way, Greg began the process of clearing out her belongings. He packed up what he wanted to keep and arranged for movers to transport the rest to a storage facility. Thanks to Mark Taylor's adept selling skills, Greg efficiently sold off the furniture. Once the house was empty, Greg conducted a final inspection before tackling his last task. He carefully gathered the wedding photos, the album, and Susan's wedding gown and took them to the patio fire pit beneath the treehouse. He meticulously arranged the photos and album on the embers, doused the dress with lighter fluid, and struck a match. As the flames consumed everything, Greg felt a sense of satisfaction, observing the intricate details of each photo as they turned to ash. The following day, Greg completed the sale of the marital home, using Susan's power of attorney to sign the documents on her behalf. Though she should have reviewed the documents with a separate financial power of attorney, Greg finalized the transaction and deposited the proceeds into his personal account, closing their joint accounts. 3 days later, during Susan's first week in France, a construction crew began demolishing the house. The rubble was cleared, and preparations for new construction commenced. Unfortunately, the tree that had supported the treehouse, a favorite spot for the children, had to be removed to make way for a planned gazebo. Construction, however, came to an abrupt halt when an issue with the permitting process arose. Greg, who had a friend from law school working in the county permit office, remained hopeful that the matter would be resolved by the time Susan returned from France, pending the approval of the necessary forms. Throughout this period, Greg avoided all attempts by Susan to contact him, providing evasive responses to her inquiries. Shadow updated Greg on Susan and Chris' apparent distress, hinting that Susan might be sensing something was off. When asked about Susan's rings, Greg declined to comment, prompting Shadow to suggest finding another potential recipient. Greg agreed to this idea. 2 days before Susan was set to return, Greg unexpectedly received the divorce decree from Tom's office. After he departed, Shadow advised him to take a public vacation. Following this advice, Greg traveled to New York, reuniting with college friends and engaging in various activities, primarily financed by credit cards. He ensured his presence was recognized by hotel staff through generous tips. While in New York, he also overnight mailed a DVD to Susan's parents' house, which showed him burning her wedding dress and album. Late one Sunday night, after Greg had enjoyed coffee and cake in Little Italy, Manhattan, his phone rang. It was his father-in-law asking, "Greg, where are you? Susan's in the hospital. She's losing her mind." "What happened?" Greg asked, intrigued by the unfolding drama. "She returned from a business trip on Friday, but she and a colleague were apparently kidnapped at the airport. They were heavily medicated and could only get out this morning. The co-worker was severely beaten and almost died, and Susan—" Her father's voice trembled. "Once, Greg, I might have felt sympathy. When Susan woke up, she found herself covered head to toe in tattoos, with vile inscriptions like strumpet and a loose woman. And then, a masked man came in, broke her nose, and gave her 2 black eyes." Greg thought it was almost poetic justice. "It's like the cherry on top," he mused. "I would have been satisfied if Susan had realized I had exposed her in court, just as she had betrayed me in marriage. But this is just an extra layer of sweet revenge." "I'm sorry to hear that," Greg said to his father-in-law, maintaining his composure. "I'm currently out of town. What should I do about Susan's situation?" Greg's father-in-law sounded shocked as he reminded Greg that Susan was still his wife. Calmly, Greg revealed that they had been divorced as of the previous week and accused Susan of cheating on him with the man she was traveling with. Despite the harshness of his words, Greg offered to send his father-in-law a copy of the video as evidence of Susan's betrayal. There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line, and Greg wondered if his father-in-law was in shock. Eventually, his father-in-law's voice came through, firm and resolute. He declared that their association with Susan was over and indicated that Greg would need to handle her from now on. After a heated exchange of words, his father-in-law abruptly ended the call, leaving Greg to reflect on their strained relationship. It dawned on Greg that the pressures of city life had become overwhelming. He shot off an email to Nico, resigning from his position and expressing his disdain for the firm, though he kept it polite. An internet search revealed an REI store in Soho, where Greg purchased new hiking and camping gear. Susan had never cared for camping, so this seemed like the perfect opportunity for him to reconnect with his adventurous side. The hotel where he stayed was accommodating and agreed to store his luggage for a reasonable fee. Greg headed to the Adirondack Mountains to immerse himself in nature and let things settle. With his passport in hand, He also had the option to travel to Canada if he wished, which turned out to be a viable option. For most of the next 8 weeks, he kept his phone off. Initially, he thought a lunatic had stolen Susan's phone, given the dozens, if not hundreds, of frantic messages filled with screaming and crying. He listened to a few of the voicemails and deleted the rest, assuming her email account had been hacked. There was no way he had the time or inclination to wade through all that chaos. He hoped that whoever this frantic woman was, she would receive the help she so clearly needed. 8 weeks later, Greg met Evan for a drink, with Tom joining them. Tom informed Greg that they had terminated their relationship with their attorney after Greg had been served the divorce decree via registered mail. Greg admitted he hadn't checked his mail yet. Tom described the situation as a major issue, while Evan compared it to a full-blown disaster. Tom then asked Evan to start discussing the problem on Monday morning. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter, accompanied by her parents, visited the old homestead. They hadn't removed the exterior camera in time, and upon seeing the vacant lot, she had an emotional breakdown. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing and curling up into a fetal position, her tantrum escalating into kicking and screaming like a child having a meltdown in a late-night mall. When the equipment crew arrived, her anger flared up once more. The third outburst came when construction workers noticed the tattoos on her face, causing them to laugh. The quality of the work was such that the text was clearly visible on camera, including derogatory phrases like strumpet and I love face, despite her raccoon eyes and duct-taped broken nose. Tom explained that later that afternoon, Susan and several lawyers from prominent firms arrived at his office without an appointment. After making them wait for 15 minutes, Tom made sure his Glock was loaded in his desk, taking advantage of Virginia's laws. When their wait was over, they launched into a tirade of complaints about emergency motions, bar complaints, and contempt proceedings. Tom couldn't ignore the ink all over Susan's face, clearly marked in red and blue for visibility. Once he managed to regain his focus, he inquired about which statements in the documents were false. The lawyers all looked at each other in silence. Tom then asked if there was a dispute about Greg's ex-wife committing infidelity. They all confirmed it. He then played the videotape he had prepared while they were waiting, showing Susan engaged in intimate acts in the marital bed with someone other than her husband. It was evident that they hadn't thoroughly reviewed all the case files as everyone looked around in confusion. Tom recounted that Susan had begun shouting, claiming Greg hadn't given her a chance to explain. To this, Tom responded that Greg was indifferent to her reasons as long as the matter was resolved. Eventually, Susan regained her composure and argued that she had never agreed to let Greg sell the house, or to the destruction of her wedding dress, pictures, and album, which she insisted were her personal property. Tom presented her with copies of the powers of attorney, including one specifically for the house sale and the property settlement agreement, which granted Greg discretion over her personal belongings. He pointed out that she was fortunate to still have her clothes. He then asked her if she disputed the authenticity of her signature on the documents. Susan conceded that the signature was hers, but insisted she had never agreed to the terms. Tom challenged her defense, asking if she was claiming she had never read what she signed, and how she would fare under cross-examination if she contested any part of the court documents. At this, Susan fell silent. He also pointed out an affidavit she had signed, acknowledging that her lover was present in the house at the time of signing. This caused her to lose consciousness. Despite Tom's efforts to revive her, he eventually called for emergency assistance. Susan refused to go to the hospital, but began yelling about the tattoos and her boyfriend's mistreatment. Tom reassured her that as far as he knew, Greg had nothing to do with it and was out of town. He speculated that Chris might have angered another woman's husband, or a woman who thought Susan was attacking Chris. Tom informed Greg that he had advised Susan and her legal team to discuss any potential criminal case with the Fairfax Police Department. He expressed regret for missing the altercation, but noted that things were progressing. Later, Tom explained that they were still considering filing a motion for reconsideration when he received an anonymous email. The email contained links to videos of Susan and Chris engaging in intimate acts in Greg's bed, with the Eiffel Tower in the background. The email threatened to send these tapes to everyone Susan knew, claiming that Greg was unaware and unable to prevent it. The senders, identifying themselves as friends of Greg, who had offered protection but also threatened to expose the tapes unless Susan backed off, left Greg shocked. He insisted that he was unaware of this development. Tom mentioned that after the revelation, the individuals behind the anonymous email vanished without further contact, and no significant developments occurred at the courthouse. He then recounted Evan's encounter with the police, noting that detectives had initially sought copies of the tapes and reports but soon lost interest. Neither Susan nor Chris could recall the details of the incident, only that they had taken a cab from the airport and ended up in a hospital. Chris was hospitalized, and Susan had woken up in a seedy hotel, was assaulted, and then hospitalized. The hotel charges, including room service and minibar costs, were billed to Susan's credit card. Greg mentioned that the New York police and his friends had been contacted, all of whom verified his busy schedule in the city. Tom added that Greg's ex-wife was reportedly undergoing laser tattoo removal in her parents' basement, which was costly due to the extensive coverage. Greg made a comment about this, which earned him a glance from Tom and stifled laughter from Evan. Tom then brought up the condition of the individual known as the meat eater, who had sustained severe injuries and would require extensive therapy due to multiple concussions. Finding another job might be difficult for him, especially since their firm had also let him go. Tom explained that their relationship had deteriorated during the trip, negatively affecting the arbitration process. Mistakes had been made, exhibits were unprepared, and witness notes were lost, leaving the client unsatisfied. Efforts were made to secure future work, but Evan hinted that someday Greg would need to explain some things. Greg responded with a joke, comparing himself to a Boy Scout. Evan went on to mention that Ella had waited in the car and expressed a touch of envy about Greg's situation. They agreed to continue their discussion over dinner, with Greg offering to treat them as a thank you for their help in his liberation. As Greg drove away, Ella surprised him by revealing that she didn't have a boyfriend. Greg then suggested heading home, with a quick stop at the post office. When Ella asked why, Greg explained that he wanted to check on a friend's safety, producing a card from the glove compartment featuring a Boy Scout emblem.